Out. The day Harold Finch handed over the keys to that rusted-out woodworking shop on the edge of Pemberton Road, he laughed so hard his assistant had to look away. It wasn't a polite laugh. It wasn't the kind of chuckle a man swallows when he's trying to be professional. It was the full thing, shoulders shaking, eyes watering, the laugh of a man who genuinely believed he had just won something. Harold Finch was the kind of man who kept score. Out. He ran Finch Property Group out of a glass and steel office in downtown Kelowna, British Columbia, the sort of office with a receptionist who wore a headset even when no one was calling. He had made his money the way a lot of men in his position had made theirs, by seeing what other people needed and charging them accordingly. Out. He owned 3 commercial buildings on Bernard Avenue, 2 storage facilities east of the highway, and a vacation property near Peachland that he rented out in summer for rates that made people wince when they saw the listing. He was not a man who lost money. Out. Which is exactly why, when the old Crestwood workshop property had sat on his books for 4 years generating nothing but property tax bills, and the occasional call from bylaw enforcement about overgrown weeds along the fence line, he had decided to unload it, fast, for whatever someone would take it off his hands for. The man who took it was named Douglas Parr. Out. Douglas was 47 years old, and if Harold Finch had bothered to look at him for more than 30 seconds, he might have noticed the calluses on his hands, the way he measured the doorframe with his eyes before he even stepped inside, the quiet, focused way he walked through each room, not the way a desperate man walks through a building he can't afford to be picky about, but the way a man with a plan walks through a space he's already mentally rebuilt. Harold didn't notice any of that. Out. What Harold noticed was that Douglas drove a 2009 Dodge pickup with a crack in the passenger side mirror and wore a Carhartt jacket with a tear at the left elbow. He noticed that Douglas asked very few questions, which Harold mistook for ignorance rather than what it actually was, certainty. The property was a wreck. Anyone could see that. Out. The main workshop building was a 3,200 square foot timber frame structure that had been built in the early 1960s by a man named Earl Crestwood, who had run a custom furniture business out of it for 30 years before his health gave out and the place sat idle. The roof had a sag in the southwest corner. 3 of the 8 windows along the north wall were boarded up. Out. The concrete floor had cracked in 2 places, and someone at some point had attempted a repair with the wrong mix and made it worse. The electrical panel was outdated. The plumbing in the small washroom at the back hadn't worked in 6 years. Outside, there was a lean-to shed attached to the east wall that was half collapsed, and beyond that a fenced yard overgrown with wild grasses and poplar saplings that had pushed up through the gravel over the years. Out. In the far corner of the yard, under 2 tarps that had gone gray with age and UV exposure, sat something that Harold had never once thought to look at. He was asking $32,000 for the property. Douglas offered $22,000, they settled at $26,500, and Harold drove back to his glass office feeling very good about himself. Unloaded the Crestwood place, he told his assistant, dropping into his chair. Some guy, handyman type. Out. Good luck to him. He didn't think about Douglas Parr again for almost a year. Douglas had grown up in Salmon Arm, the second of 3 sons born to a man who fixed small engines for a living and a woman who taught grade 4 at the local elementary school. Out. There wasn't a lot of money, but there was always something being built or repaired in the garage, and Douglas had grown up understanding that the world was divided into 2 kinds of people, those who could make things, and those who paid other people to do it. Out. He had spent 20 years working in custom cabinetry and millwork, first as an apprentice under a retired contractor in Vernon, then running his own small shop out of a rented unit in West Kelowna until the landlord sold the building and the new owner tripled the rent in 60 days. Douglas had tried to find another affordable commercial space for 8 months. He found nothing. Out. The market in the Okanagan had gone the way markets go when too much money arrives too fast. Everything became expensive, and the people who had been there longest could afford it least. He had been storing his tools in a friend's barn and doing contract work off the back of his truck when his son, a 22-year-old named Brett who was studying architecture at UBC Okanagan, sent him a link to the Crestwood listing one Thursday evening with a message that said, "Dad, look at this." Out. Actually, look at it. Douglas looked at it. He looked at it for a long time. The listing photos were bad, taken on someone's phone in the late afternoon when the light came in at a flat angle and made everything look worse than it was. The ceiling looked lower than it was. The cracks in the floor looked wider. The boards over the windows made the whole space feel abandoned rather than dormant. Harold Finch's agent had done the bare minimum, but Douglas saw the bone. Out. He saw the timber frame, which in a building that age, properly maintained or not, was likely old-growth Douglas fir, the kind of wood you couldn't buy anymore, the kind that was harder than anything a modern mill produced. He saw the ceiling height, which had to be 16 feet at the peak. He saw the north-facing windows, perfect for a workshop where you needed consistent, non-direct light for finishing work. Out. He saw the size of the yard and he thought about lumber storage, about a future spray booth, about room to grow. And then he drove out to look at the property in person and he saw the tarps in the corner of the yard. He didn't lift them that day, he walked around them. He pressed his boot against what was underneath one edge and felt resistance, solid, not hollow. Out. He looked at the shape beneath the canvas, the general dimensions, and he kept his face very neutral as he walked back toward the building. He made the call to Harold's agent the next morning. The first 6 weeks after closing were the hardest. Douglas was working alone. Brett drove up from Kelowna on weekends to help when he could, and a retired electrician named Frank, who had done work for Douglas before, came in to assess the panel and draw up a rewiring quote that was steep but manageable. Out. Douglas's older brother Ray, who ran a roofing crew out of Kamloops, drove down one Saturday and spent the day on the southwest corner of the roof with Douglas, the two of them not saying a lot, just working, the way brothers who grew up in the same household sometimes can. The roof was solid underneath the damaged section. That was the first real piece of luck, or rather the first confirmation that Douglas's read on the building had been right. Out. The sag was cosmetic, a consequence of years of snow load and a single failed rafter, not structural rot through the whole system. Ray fixed it in a day. The concrete floor took longer. Douglas studied 3 different approaches, talked to a guy he knew who did industrial flooring in Penticton, and eventually ground down the failed repair sections and poured new. It wasn't cheap and it wasn't fast, but when it cured, it was right. The windows came out and new ones went in. Out. The plumbing got replaced. The lean-to-shed on the east wall Douglas tore down himself in an afternoon, stacking the usable lumber neatly and disposing of the rest properly, the way a man who respects materials does. And then, on a Tuesday in late October, 6 weeks after he had taken possession of the property, Douglas Parr walked out into the backyard with a utility knife and began to cut the tie-downs on the first tarp. What was underneath changed everything. Out. Earl Crestwood, as it turned out, had been many things besides a furniture maker. He had also, quietly and without much fanfare, spent the better part of 3 decades collecting pieces. Not cars, exactly, though there were 2 of those. What was mostly under those tarps was equipment. A Walker-Turner bandsaw from 1948 still on its original cast-iron stand, the kind of machine that sold at restoration auctions for more than most people spent on used cars. Out. A Greenard hydraulic press from the 1950s. 3 Craftsman drill presses from the post-war era in various states of disassembly, but with all their parts present, labeled and stored in coffee cans that were still sealed with masking tape and Earl's handwriting. Number 2 chuck assembly fits all 3. A Northfield number 4 jointer, which Douglas stood in front of for a full minute without speaking. Under the second tarp were the 2 vehicles. Out. A 1964 Buick Riviera, black, which had clearly been driven into that yard sometime in the 1980s and not moved since, but which was complete. Every piece of trim, the original interior, the nailhead V8 sitting under the hood like it was waiting, and a 1957 Ford Ranchero in what had been turquoise and white, which had a rusted rocker panel on the driver's side and a crack in the windshield, but was otherwise, as Douglas would later say, better than it had any right to be. Out. He stood in that yard for a long time. Then he went inside, sat down on the cooler he'd been using as a lunch table, and called Brett. "You need to come up this weekend," he said. "Why, what happened? Just come." Douglas was methodical about what came next in a way that reflected who he was. Not reckless, not giddy, but deliberate. He documented everything first. Photographed every piece of equipment, every vehicle, every component stored in Earl Crestwood's labeled coffee cans. Out. He researched values carefully, spending evenings on auction records, collector forums, asking quiet questions of people who knew. He sold nothing immediately. That was the discipline that cost him in the short term and paid him in the long. Instead, he opened the workshop. He had enough equipment of his own, his table saw, his router, his planers and sanders and finishing tools, to begin taking on work. Out. He put out the word carefully through the network he had built over 20 years, custom cabinetry, built-ins, furniture restoration. The work came slowly at first, the way it always does when you're starting somewhere new, and then it came faster as people saw what he produced. By February, he had a waiting list. Out. By March, he had hired a part-time helper, a kid named Spencer who had dropped out of the cabinet-making program at Okanagan College, not because he lacked talent, but because he learned better with his hands than with a textbook, and who turned out to be one of the fastest learners Douglas had ever worked with. The Northfield jointer he restored himself, evenings and weekends over 2 months, stripping it down to the castings and rebuilding it with new bearings and a precision ground table. Out. When he turned it on for the first time after the restoration, it ran smoother than any machine he had ever owned. He listed it with a specialty dealer in Ontario. It sold in 11 days for more than he had paid Harold Finch for the entire property. He used those funds to begin the Buick. Out. Harold Finch heard about Crestwood Workshop for the first time from his wife, who mentioned that a friend of hers had hired a woodworker in that area of town and he was extraordinary. The best she'd seen, prices were fair, there was a wait. Harold asked where the shop was. His wife described the location. Harold nodded slowly and said nothing. He drove past it the following Saturday. He slowed down in front of the building. The property was transformed, the fence had been repaired and painted out. The gravel yard was neat and organized, with a lumber storage rack along one side built from what looked like the timbers from the old lean-to. The windows were new. The sign above the workshop door was simple, hand-routed Douglas fir, painted in dark green, Parr and Son woodcraft. Harold sat in his car for a moment, then he drove away. He didn't stop. He told himself he didn't need to, but the sign stayed with him. The Buick took Douglas and Brett 14 months from start to finish. Out. They worked on it the way families sometimes work on things together. Not always efficiently, occasionally with raised voices about the right approach to the quarter-panel repair, but with a steadiness that had nothing to do with speed and everything to do with intent. Brett had grown up watching his father work. He understood the standard that was expected. Out. He also brought things Douglas didn't have: a precise eye for symmetry, an ability to research obscure factory specifications that the online community had documented in extraordinary detail, a patience with the chrome and trim work that Douglas openly admitted exceeded his own. Out. The Ranchero they sold as is to a collector in Alberta, before they had finished the Buick, for a number that covered 6 months of Spencer's wages, and the spray booth Douglas had finally been able to build along the south wall of the yard. It was a straightforward transaction. The collector knew what he was getting, Douglas knew what he was selling, and the price was honest. The Buick was different. Out. When it was finished, and finished meant finished, not presentable, Douglas had it detailed, photographed professionally, and contacted an auction house in Vancouver that dealt in significant collector vehicles. The photographs were sent on a Thursday. Out. By the following Monday, Douglas had a call from the auction specialist, a woman named Diane who had been in the business for 22 years and who spoke in the flat, specific language of someone who had stopped being impressed by things and learned instead to simply assess them accurately. "This is a correct car," Diane said. "Yes," Douglas said. "Documentation. Original build sheet is in the glove box. All numbers match." Out. "I have the restoration records, every part sourced, every supplier, every hour." There was a pause. "How would you like to proceed?" The Buick crossed the auction block in Vancouver on a Saturday morning in April. Douglas drove down for it. Brett drove down with him. They sat in the third row of the bidding floor, Douglas in the same Carhartt jacket with the tear at the elbow that he'd worn the day he handed Harold Finch a bank draft for $26,500. Out. The bidding opened and moved quickly. It slowed at one point and then jumped, the way bids on a correct car tend to jump when two people in a room decide they both need to have it. When the hammer came down, Douglas sat very still for a moment. Then he looked at his son. Brett had his hands pressed flat on his thighs. He was looking straight ahead. "Dad," Brett said quietly. "I know," Douglas said. The final number was $287,000. Out. Harold Finch was at a fundraising dinner in Kelowna that same evening when a business acquaintance mentioned the auction. The man had seen it on a collector forum he followed, said some shop out near the old industrial strip had consigned a '64 Riviera that had gone absolutely stupid at the block in Vancouver. Nearly $300,000. Beautiful car, the forum said. Shop was called Parr and Son. Harold set down his wine glass. He left the dinner early, told his wife he wasn't feeling well. Out. He drove home through the dark streets of the city with the specific feeling of a man doing arithmetic in his head that he doesn't want to finish. $26,500. He had taken it. Gladly. He had laughed. Douglas Parr did not dwell on Harold Finch. That is the honest truth of it, and it matters. He did not wake up in the mornings thinking about the man's laughter in the driveway, or imagine the look on his face when the auction numbers reached the forums. Out. Douglas was not built that way, and the version of him that might have been, the version that stewed and rehearsed and imagined confrontations, had been worn away by 20 years of working with his hands, where the material tells you whether you got it right and no amount of resentment changes a bad joint. What Douglas thought about was the next thing. There were 3 more pieces of Earl Crestwood's equipment still in the restoration queue. Out. Spencer had asked about going full-time, and the books justified it. Brett had graduated and had been offered a position with a firm in Calgary, which was a good offer and the right move for him, but he had also come to Douglas with something else. A question, really, framed carefully the way Brett framed things he felt uncertain about. "What if I came back here instead?" Brett said. "What if we made this into something bigger?" Douglas looked at his son for a long time. "Bigger how?" he said. Out. "There's a property 2 lots east that's coming available, full acre. We could build a proper finishing facility, Custom furniture, cabinetry, restorations, everything under one roof. I could run the design side, you run production. Douglas leaned against the workbench and looked at the ceiling, the old-growth fir beams that had been there since Earl Crestwood built the place, dark with age and solid as the day they were milled out. He thought about the man who had built this building and what he had left behind under those tarps, not carelessly but deliberately. The coffee cans with the masking tape labels, everything catalogued, waiting for someone who would understand it. Let's build it right, Douglas said. The property east of them closed 8 weeks later. Harold Finch did reach out. Not in person, that was not the kind of man he was. He sent a note through his agent inquiring whether Parr and Son would be interested in selling the Crestwood property, framed as a courtesy, phrased as if the idea had only just occurred to him. He attached a number that was more than he had sold it for but considerably less than it was now worth. Douglas read the note on his phone standing in the workshop. Spencer was running the new bandsaw along the back wall. The smell of fresh pine filled the space. He typed back a single line, not for sale, Thank you for the opportunity 4 years ago. He put the phone in his pocket and went back to work. Outside, Pemberton Road was quiet in the early morning, the way small industrial streets are quiet before the day starts. Just the sound of a loader somewhere in the distance and the particular clean smell of a spring morning in the interior of British Columbia, where the air still carries something from the mountains. The sign above the door caught the light the way it always did at that hour. Parr and Son Woodcraft, Earl Crestwood would have approved.